On October 1st of 1997, a 16-year-old woke up with pure evil on his mind. After first doing something terrible at his home, he would continue his awful streak at his school, Pearl High School. This is the case of Luke Woodham. Hello, friend, and welcome to High Time Crime. My name's Joel, and on here I specialize in true crime and frequencies. Right now, you're hearing 528 hertz, and you are feeling positive, happy, and wealthy beyond belief. The world is yours. But anyway, today we're going over a very twisted case involving a 16-year-old who was in 11th grade, who also just so happened to be a part of some weird cult. Luke Timms Woodham was born on February 5th of 1981 to Mary Ann Timms Woodham and John P. Woodham II. Luke was the second child to Mary and John, and I'll talk about them briefly. John was an accountant originally from Newton, Mississippi, where his family lived for a very long time. John wanted to have a family of his own and finally leave Newton, and so he did. In 1965, he found himself in Pearl, Mississippi, which seemed to be a very good place to raise children. John at the time was 28 years old, and shortly after arriving in Pearl, he met a woman who was 20 years old named Mary Ann Timms. Mary Ann was a blonde-haired girl who many people really liked. Her personality was that of someone who, as they always say, would light up a room. John and Mary appeared to be a very good couple for quite some time, and only 2 years after meeting in 1967, they got married. Not long after getting married, they bought a 3-bedroom home in Pearl, and thus began their lives. The idea was that John would support Mary Ann and himself by working his accountant job, and at the same time, they would try to start their own little family. But unfortunately, for the next several years, Mary Ann would try to get pregnant, but fail. And so eventually she became a substitute teacher to kindergartners, and only part-time. This was because her and John were still trying to have a baby. 6 years after they got married, Mary Ann finally had gotten pregnant. In 1973, Mary Ann and John had their first child, a boy named John Woodham III. Mary Ann gave up her part-time job to become a full-time stay-at-home mother. Apparently, Mary was overprotective of John Jr. and also overly obsessive about a lot of minuscule things. Mary Ann, in 1980, would get pregnant again, and on February 5th, 1981, Luke Timms Woodham was born. Mary Ann started to show Luke pretty much all of the affection, rather than spreading it between Luke and John Jr. Apparently, Luke and his brother were not close at all, and they didn't get along. It was said that John Jr. would bully Luke and berate him, amongst other things. Not only did this become a problem between Mary Ann and her older son, but between her and her husband as well. John Sr. started to become very upset at Mary for not being able to properly clean the house while the boys were there, and a bunch of other reasons, such as Mary going out. Mary started to go out at nights to go to parties and stuff and leave Luke with John Jr. because of the amount of stress she was under. This would be yet another way for John Jr. to mess with Luke. Mary Ann began blaming Luke for the problems in her marriage. Now, when Luke got into kindergarten, he was extremely afraid because his mother typically didn't let him hang out with other children. Luke had very bad self-esteem as a child and believed that no children would want to play with him. Only a few days after beginning kindergarten, Luke was being bullied for his haircut. Luke, throughout the rest of his school year, would be picked on quite badly. Luke did have somewhere to turn though, and that was his animals at home. A dog named Sparkle, a snake, and 2 cats. He spent all day talking to them and loving them. Around this time, it was said that the household that Mary Ann ran was very crazy, that Mary was always yelling at the children, and that John Sr. was always cool, calm, and collected, but found Mary Ann's behavior very hard to deal with. John had started to really struggle at work, and within a brief period of time, he was actually fired. John felt absolutely terrible, and after getting fired, he was self-loathing around the house all day doing nothing. He was just saying rude things to Mary Ann. Some days, John wouldn't talk to anyone, and John refused to get another job. When Luke was 7 years old and in the 2nd grade in 1987, his father left the family. Mary Ann then had to raise both of the boys alone in a hectic manner. Luke would never recover from his father leaving, and this was actually a terrible thing. Luke blamed himself for what happened to his parents. His mother low-key did too. Mary Ann had hopes that John would one day return, but he never did. From 1987 to 1992, Mary Ann would make Luke eat the food she made. If he threw it away, she'd take it out of the garbage and make him eat it. She would yell at him constantly for pretty much everything. Or so he said. By 1992, though, Mary Ann and John's marriage was legally ended. Mary Ann would end up having money problems raising 2 children, and typically would have to do most of the chores, though a lot of the times she didn't. And it's hard to say if money was exactly an issue, because Mary Ann would constantly go out to party at night and leave Luke alone. His older brother was in his late teens and still bullied Luke. Sometimes Mary Ann wouldn't come home until late the next day, and so Luke would find himself with nothing to eat, except for chips and cookies and junk food. Every Sunday, Mary Ann would take both Luke and John Jr. to church, acting pretty normal. And then later in the night, she would go out. She kind of lived 2 separate worlds. But when Luke got to middle school, he was constantly teased by other kids for being overweight. They'd call him names like fat or chunky or chubby. Apparently, Luke used to get beat up all of the time, and a lot of people picked on him more than normal. This was backed up by a few separate people. Luke once again pretty much only found friends in his home with the pets he had. He loved playing fetch with his dog Sparkle. A few years later in 1995, Luke would become a freshman at Pearl High School. Immediately, he'd have problems that came from the middle school and more problems that came with the high school. It started off because his mom insisted on dropping him off close to the school doors, and typically kids like to be dropped off further away so other kids couldn't see their parents. Not only that, but Mary Ann would also kiss Luke on the cheek every morning before he got out of the car. A kid named Ben in one of Luke's classes said something about his mother doing that, and so Luke attacked him. Luckily for that kid, other people were around and quickly pulled Luke off of him, because if they hadn't, who knows what would have happened. Luke felt like he had nowhere to turn in school, and so he began going to the library to read and escape from the outside world. Luke began reading books from Aristotle, Plato, Nietzsche, and other writers such as Shakespeare. Now that Luke was always reading, his bullies had yet another thing to be able to pick on him for. Luke in high school began gaining weight pretty fast. He was already overweight, but it never got better, only worse. Luke would walk around the school with his eyes glued to the floor, because a lot of the times, if he looked up at other students, like the sports players, they would grab his bag and crush everything inside of it. Luke, in his 9th grade year, did try to make things better and wrote on a paper his 3 goals for freshman year. His first goal was to pass his exams with fairly good grades. His second goal was to get along with all of his teachers, and his third goal was to start a band. Luke also became friends with a guy named Wes and a guy named Daniel, and also a girl named Leanne. Luke that year wanted to attend prom, but had no one to go with, and Marianne had told Luke he couldn't go unless someone drove him there and back. Now, Luke's friend Leanne lived a few doors down and drove to school and had actually driven Luke a few times, so she went to the prom with Luke. Luke had a great time, but this was just a short-lived affair. Now in school, Luke had some interesting writings. He wrote a 32-page essay where he killed teachers, looted banks, and tortured the principal. I don't think that writing was ever released, but I guess no one was too concerned about it. In another writing, Luke had been asked how he would spend the day as his teacher. His teacher was a woman named Valerie Neal, and in this writing, Luke wrote, "If I could spend a day as Mrs. Neal, I would be very, very nice to Luke Woodham and pass him for the year. Then I would knock the crud out of the omniscient dork for putting junk on my computer. Then I would go crazy and kill all of the other teachers. Then I would slowly and very painfully torture all of the principals to death. Then I would withdraw all of my money in the bank and give it to Luke Woodham. Then I would get all of the other teachers' and principals' bank account numbers, withdraw all of the money, and give it to Luke Woodham. Then I would do acid. Then I would get a gun and my brains out all over the doggone room and leave my house to Luke Woodham." Mrs. Neal never said anything about this or had any concerns, which I am so confused about. Like, did she even read that? In another writing, the assignment was to write about an incident that Luke did that upset his parents. He decided to write about a fictional event instead. I've never really done anything that bad, so I'll make up a story. One day, I killed a guy and shot his dog in the butt with a big friggin' pellet gun. Then I went to a phone booth and robbed it by yanking the little coin box out of it. Then I threw water balloons at some nuns, and I went inside their church and set the priest's wig on fire. It was the first time I'd heard a good Catholic person say God. Then I burned the church down, then danced around it, and sung 2 Nine Inch Nails songs, one called Heresy and another called Terrible Lie. Then I robbed a bank and set it on fire. I love to set things on fire and killed all the tellers. When the police came, I killed them all, and when the National Guard came, I killed most of them, but they finally caught me. Once again, was no one concerned about this? But in the summer of 1996, a girl named Christy Menifee moved to Pearl with her family. She was similar to Luke in the sense that her parents divorced, and she lived with her mother, but also with her father at times. We'll get into that a little bit later, but Christy would start attending Pearl High School and immediately took notice to Luke. They shared common interests like their love of animals, and to Christy, Luke seemed really sweet. Luke actually asked Christy out on a date, and to his surprise, she said yes. Luke pretty much never talked to anyone, let alone girls, and so this was a huge change in his life. He was ecstatic. On the couple's first date together, Luke was very embarrassed because his mother drove him and Christy to the movie theater, and then she waited there for them to be finished watching. Christy began to think that it was weird that Luke's mother pretty much followed him all over the place. Their relationship started off good, but quickly things began to turn sour. Christy told a friend that Luke was getting too controlling and that he would get very mad at her if she didn't call him at a certain time or walk with him to class. Luke really thought that he loved Christy, and he felt so lucky dating her. He began to become overprotective to the point that it was suffocating Christy, and she thought that Luke was very emotionally immature. At home, Marianne would tell Luke how to wash himself to smell good for Christy, and really tried to get him to cut his hair. Luke told his mother that Christy liked it long, but his mother was very pushy. By this point in Luke and Christy's short relationship, the only time they kissed or did anything was when Luke kissed her on the cheek. But within less than a month of dating, Christy felt like she couldn't deal with Luke anymore. So on October 1st of 1996, Christy broke up with Luke and told him that it was embarrassing to have his mom on the date with both of them. Luke was absolutely shocked by this because he thought things were just getting started and going great. He had literally in his mind seen him and Christy taking it all the way to marriage. Luke then began to really hate his mother Marianne because he felt like this was all of her fault. Luke was now heartbroken and wrote all about Christy in his journal and little poems that he would make. Things would get worse for Luke when, for some reason, Christy decided to send him a letter that told him she loved another guy and sent him a photo of her. This confused Luke, and to be honest, I'd be a little confused too, but after this, boy, would things get worse. Luke began appearing where Christy would be at in school, and he would just try to be near her and stare at her without saying anything. His entire life was falling apart and at a very fast rate. Now, albeit the fact that Luke and Christy dated for like 3 weeks and he only kissed her on the cheek and they hung out just a few times, Luke felt like he fell in love with her, regardless of the time spent. After this couple broke up, Luke apparently tried to take himself out with his father's old guns that were in the attic, but he was talked out of it by Christy and a friend of his. Luke at school told Christy that he was going to do it, hence the reason she called. Now at Pearl High School, there was a certain group of students who were very involved in role-playing type of games, specifically Dungeons and Dragons, which is a role-playing game where players gather together and create an imaginary adventure to maybe defeat monsters or find treasure. Luke loved the idea of role-playing because he could be someone other than himself. At the school, there was a senior who was 2 years older than Luke named Grant Boyette, and Luke became infatuated with Grant. Grant had good parents, and they were founding members of a local church. Grant would go to school dressed in nice clothes, wearing a tie, and he told people that he dressed this way because he was a Christian. Grant also kept his hair in a nice manner, and his appearance was well kept. Eventually, Luke and Grant would become very good friends, and there were a few other boys a part of the group they soon formed as well. To make this pretty simple and easy to understand, Grant was pretty much considered to be a cult leader. He would tell the boys in his group to do things, such as if they had a problem with their parents, to kill them, or other heinous things. He would attempt to live out his evil fantasies through other people. Grant had now started calling this group of boys the Croth, and they'd read a lot together, play Star Wars, and just hang out all the time. Oh, and also talk about murder. All of these boys were outcasts at Pearl High School. But the Croth is supposedly a bad version of a German word Krot, which means toad. Now Grant and Luke really got into witchcraft and casting spells, and they began to study a book called the Necronomicon. By January of 1997, Luke decided to try to see if he could really cast spells on someone, so he chose a guy at Pearl High School named Danny. Apparently, Danny talked down to Luke and tried to use him, and he didn't like him for that. Luke talked to Grant on the phone and told him about Danny, and so Grant told Luke to use the pentagram that he gave him to cast a spell. Eventually, Grant would go to Luke's house and read the Necronomicon and cast a spell against Danny. As Grant began chanting the spell, Luke said he started to vision not Danny in his mind, but Danny's friend, Rocky Brewer. And as it just so happens to turn out, a few days later, on January 4th of 1997, Charles Robert Rocky Brewer went to the park skating rink to meet a bunch of his friends. Next to the park was a 4-lane highway called Lakeland Drive, and so Rocky told his friends he was gonna run across the highway to get a drink at the restaurant on the other side. When Rocky went to do that, he ended up getting hit by a car and he died. Rocky was actually about to be a father too. It's pretty upsetting. Meanwhile, Luke and Grant were at Luke's home, and shortly after this happened, a friend of theirs named Danny walked in, very upset. Danny told Luke and Grant that Rocky was dead. Luke immediately began to believe that Rocky died because of the spell that him and Grant had casted on Danny. Luke asked Grant about it, and Grant told him, well, you wanted Danny to leave you alone, and now he'll never bother you again. After this happened, Luke and Grant became closer than ever, and they both began to try and cast spells against people they hated. Luke began to believe that Grant had special powers to do things. So a little bit about Grant is that once again, he was from a very Christian household, and around 1993, he became fascinated with writings. Grant projected himself to the outside world as a Christian, but in reality, he was a huge follower of Satan. Luke looked up to Grant as his sort of savior. Well, all of the boys in the Croft did. They all looked up to Grant for his wisdom and advice, even though his advice was horrendous. Luke, for example, looked to Grant for his advice about Christy, his ex-girlfriend. Grant told Luke that he can get rid of his heartache by killing Christy, and that she deserved it. Luke's obsession to please Grant went very far because he believed Grant was the only person who accepted him for him and that actually cared about him. Now, for the next several months, things were going to ramp up and get even more horrendous. Members of the Croft began to become concerned by Grant. Grant's other friends were concerned by him. But Luke and Grant, they were spiraling. At Pearl High School, this group was known as Satan's Children because they started wearing black trench coats and kids actively avoided them. Luke loved this because he felt like the other kids knew they shouldn't f with him. It fed his ego. Now by Tuesday, April 8th of 1997, Luke didn't go to school because he didn't want to. His mother, Mary Ann, was already at work, and so she couldn't say no, even if she wanted to. Eventually, Grant joined Luke at his home, and they started talking about the beauty of death and decided that they were going to kill Luke's dog, Sparkle, to see how the dog would react to pain. Luke and Grant took the dog outside and beat it with a stick. Apparently, Luke's neighbor actually saw them doing this, but never reported it. Why would you not report it? Luke and Grant didn't kill Sparkle, but now Sparkle had a very bad limp and trouble walking. So about 2 days later, on April 10th, Luke's older brother John Jr. told Luke to take Sparkle to the vet, and Luke said that Sparkle was fine, that she probably just stepped on something. 2 more days would pass, and on April 12th, John Jr. said to Luke, once again, to take Sparkles to the vet. Luke said he would do it sometime early next week. Luke apparently got scared that the vet would see the bruises on Sparkle's leg and that he'd get in trouble. Luke then called Grant, and Grant came over his house at about 2 p.m. Luke wrote in his journal about killing Sparkle, and it's very graphic, and so I refuse to read it. Just know that what Luke wrote and what they did was absolutely sickening. Luke would later tell his mother that Sparkle must have ran away, and John Jr., Luke's brother, thought this was very suspicious, and he tried to talk to Luke about it a few times, but nothing came from it. This same month, or April of 1997, Luke also wrote an interesting log in his journal that I'll now read to you. I am the hatred in every man's heart. I am the epitome of all evil. I have no mercy for humanity, for they created me. They tortured me until I snapped and became what I am today. My advice to any man who has been tortured by humanity is this. Let these words ring through our heart, mind, and soul. Hate humanity, hate humanities. Hate what humanity has made you. Hate what you have become. Most of all, hate the accursed God of Christianity. Hate him for making humanity. Hate him for making you. Hate him for flinging you into a monstrous life you did not ask for nor deserve. Fill your heart, mind, and soul with hatred until it's all you know, until your conscience becomes a fiery tomb of hatred for the goodness in your soul. Hate everyone and everything. Hate where you were and are. Hate until you can't anymore. Then learn, read poetry books, philosophy books, history books, science books, autobiographies, and biographies. Become a sponge for knowledge. Study the philosophies of others and condense the parts you like as your own. Make your own rules, live by your own laws, for now truly you should be at peace and your own true self. Live your life in a bold, new way, for you, dear friend, are a Superman. The last part of that writing wasn't too bad, but it really started off terrible. Now, a few months would pass, and by the summer of 1997, Luke said he began to see demons that were red-cloaked with glowing eyes, spikes on their head with no hair, and that they were tall. Luke said that these demons came to him at night when he was alone for a few minutes, and they always told him to kill people. Apparently, Grant had told Luke when to expect these demons to visit him. Luke also around this time had apparently been stalking his ex-girlfriend Christy to try and get back with her, and Christy told a bunch of people about this. Also on June 3rd of 1997, Luke wrote this in his journal. This night, June 3rd of 1997, is a monumentous night. With this writing, I do swear that I shall never get myself in a position where I can be hurt by a woman ever again. To myself I swear this, and to the higher powers I swear this. I guess he wasn't wrong about that one. 1 week and a day later, on June 11th of 1997, apparently there had been a threat to kill a guy named Donnie Brooks's father. Donnie was a part of the Croft, but long story short, a fallout occurred, and apparently a plot had been set up to kill his father, obviously led by Grant. Donnie went to the police and told them what happened, and literally nothing came from this. Luke was upset because they didn't fall through with the plan. He wanted to kill someone. A few months later, in September of 1997, Luke was back at Pearl High School, and he got into a bit of a scuffle with a guy named Kyle Foster, who was the son of the mayor of Pearl, Jimmy Foster. Luke thought to himself that one day, Kyle will pay for this. By now, and I'm not sure exactly when, but Grant started calling Luke the assassin of the Croft, aka Luke was the one who would do all the dirty work. Grant was really egging Luke on to kill his ex-girlfriend, Christy, and not only that, but they talked about bombings and shooting up the high school. Grant was talking while Luke was imagining, and Luke was ecstatic to make it a reality. One day, Luke had told Grant that he had doubts about everything, but Grant said that he had to do it, that if he didn't, he was nothing, gutless, and spineless. Luke, not wanting to lose pretty much his only friend he's ever had, felt like he had to do whatever to please Grant. So on Sunday, September 28th of 1997, Grant told Luke that their plan to get revenge was finally approaching. 2 days later, on Tuesday, September 30th of 1997, Luke and his mother Mary Ann got into a big argument because Luke wanted to borrow her car, and she said no because Luke didn't have his license yet, and he also had very poor vision. Luke was so angry at his mother because of this, and so he ran to his room and slammed the door. He didn't come out for the entire day. Later into the night, Luke had a phone call with a member of the Croft named Lucas, and Lucas was really worried because Luke said that he was going to kill his mom in the morning. Luke was whispering because he didn't want Marianne to hear him. Lucas asked Luke how he was going to do it, and he told him with a knife. By the time the next morning would roll around, so would tragedy. On October 1st of 1997, Luke Woodham woke up very early in the morning, a little before 5 a.m., after having a very sleepless night he said was filled with visions. Luke had went to bed with a very evil plan in his mind that was talked over with Grant. Luke said when he woke up, all he could see were the demons and that he would see them whenever Grant told him to do something. These demons were telling Luke he was nothing, that he would always be nothing, unless he committed to his plan. Luke went to the kitchen where he took a large knife out of the drawer. Then he slowly crept to his bedroom to grab a pillow, and as he was walking out of the room, he saw a bat, so he grabbed that as well. Next, Luke walked out of his door, and to his surprise, he saw his mother, Marianne, walking into the kitchen. He wasn't ready for that because he thought she had been sleeping. Regardless, at this moment, he still followed through with his plan. Luke chased after Marianne, who ran to her bedroom and tried to shut the door and lock it, but Luke overpowered her. Marianne ran onto the bed while Luke smashed a chest and then swung the baseball bat at a dresser. Luke said that he could hear Grant's voice urging him on in his head, and then Luke closed his eyes, thinking that he doesn't want to do this, but he kept hearing Grant's voice telling him to. Luke looked down at his mother, who was crying, and he then lifted the bat above his head, held it there for a while, and eventually hit his mother in the face with it. Next, Luke grabbed a pillow, put it over her head, and grabbed a knife. Luke then began using the knife, and Marianne actually was able to get the pillow off of her head and looked Luke in his eyes, begging him to stop, but he didn't. Luke would then kill his mother and cut his hands pretty badly in the process. After this, Luke wasn't done, and he had more evil thoughts on his mind. Next, he went to the kitchen and got some alcohol and band-aids for his cuts. Luke then went to his room and wrote a will. I, Luke Woodham, being of a sound mind and body, will to Grant Boyett my books, to Lucas Thompson my guitar and amplifier and their equipment. I also leave my writings of philosophy and poetry to Grant Boyett. They are parts of me and must be published as pieces of my life. Also to Grant Boyett, I will on my cassette tapes. Throughout my life, I was ridiculed, always beaten, always hated. Can you, society, truly blame me for what I do? Yes, you will. The ratings wouldn't be high enough if you didn't, and it wouldn't make good gossip for all the old ladies. I am the hatred in every man's heart. I am the epitome of all evil. I have no mercy for humanity, for they created me. They tortured me until I snapped and became what I am today. Hate until you can't hate anymore, then learn, read poetry, books, philosophy books, history books, science books, autobiographies, and biographies. Become a sponge for knowledge. Study the philosophy of others and condense the parts you like as your own. Make your own rules, live by your own laws, for now, truly, you should be at peace with yourself. Live your life in a bold new way, for you, dear friend, are a Superman. He already wrote that part in a previous writing, but he then said, I am not insane. I am not angry. This world on me for the final time. I am not spoiled or lazy, for murder is not weak and slow-witted. Murder is gutsy and daring. People like me are mistreated every day. I do this to show society, push up and we will push back. I suffered all my life. No one ever truly loved me. No one ever truly cared about me. This will was also considered to be his manifesto. After Luke finished writing, he then got everything together he needed for his plan. This included his dad's favorite hunting rifle he left in the attic, a 30-30, and he got a box of shells, some ammunition, and a few other things. Next, Luke called Grant, and this is when Lucas called Luke. Luke put Grant on hold, so the call would only be him and Lucas, but Luke told Lucas that he killed his mother. Eventually, they'd hang up, and Luke and Grant would talk again, and what they talked about is unknown, but we can probably assume. At about 6:45 a.m., Luke would leave his mother's home in her car, and a neighbor had seen him back into a fence, but for some reason didn't tell anyone or say anything. At 7:45 a.m., a former friend of Luke's named Wes was a part of the Croth, walked into school, and this is when Christy, Luke's ex-girlfriend, walked up to Wes and said she's worried about Luke, that she hadn't seen him in a few days, and asked if he was okay. Wes said that he didn't know that he didn't hang out with Luke anymore, and that he hasn't spoken to him since May. Moments later, Luke would walk into the school, and this is when he gave his manifesto to a guy named Justin Sledge. We'll talk about him for a second later. Luke told Justin to give everything to Grant and then told him he needs to leave the building now. Luke then went back out to his mother's car. Justin, not knowing what this meant, quickly got the idea and told a friend that they need to go to the library, that something very bad is about to happen. That something would happen. Luke Woodham would walk back inside of the school, but this time with his father's 30-30 rifle. Luke had immediately found the person he was looking for, or his ex-girlfriend, Christy. She was talking to some friends. Luke pointed the gun at her and fired. Christy would die from her wounds. Next, Luke shot at a random person named David and hit his backpack. After that, Luke saw a girl named Lydia Dew, who I believe may have been friends with Christy. Lydia was on the ground trying to get up to run, but this is when Luke shot her in the back. Lydia was still alive for some time. At one point, she was even talking to a teacher who came to help her, but Lydia would end up dying from her wounds. Afterwards, Luke wasn't done. He then started to shoot indiscriminately at whoever he could. Eventually, he had to reload, and this is when a hero named Jason Barton came into play and tried tackling Luke. They got into a bit of a scuffle for a few seconds, but Luke was stronger than Jason and pushed him off of him, and he ran across the hall. Meanwhile, Luke had reloaded and began firing some more. Eventually, Luke shot a guy named Jerry Safely, who jumped in front of his girlfriend to save her. Jerry got shot in both of the legs, and Luke actually walked up to him and apologized because he thought that Jerry was actually Kyle Foster, the mayor's son. Meanwhile, the assistant principal of Pearl High School, Joel Myrick, was sitting in the office doing work when he heard gunshots. He immediately ran to the problem, got a bunch of students, put them into his room, and he locked the door. Joel, not knowing what to do, ran to his car and grabbed the .45 caliber pistol he kept inside of it and ran to the building. This is when he saw Luke trying to leave. Luke still had the rifle with him. Joel was a former commander in the National Guard, so he was used to this kind of thing. Luke ran to his mother's car, got inside of it, and Joel ran next to him, pointing the gun at him, ready to shoot. Luke decided to step on the gas. This is when him and another student named Justin almost crashed into each other. Justin realized that it was Luke who had committed the shooting, and so Justin put his car into reverse and blocked Luke's car. Luke tried to go around him and got onto the grass, but the car ended up getting stuck. Joel then ran around to the side of the car and pointed his .45 caliber inside the open window right into Luke's neck. Apparently, Luke was shaking very badly, and he kept trying to drive away. Eventually, the police would come, in fact, over 70 officers, and Luke would be arrested. After killing 2 people at the school and wounding 7 others, Luke's rampage was finally over. Next, he was taken to the police station, and thus would come this confession or interrogation video he made. I'm going to play that for you now.
We got up this morning. What happened at the house?
My mom was in bed. I went into the kitchen. I got a pillow. Went to the kitchen, got a butcher knife. Walked to my mom's room, put it over her head, and stabbed her to death.
Okay. Why'd you stab your mom?
She never loved me. She always told me I wouldn't amount to anything. She always told me I was fat and stupid and lazy. She blamed me for my dad leaving. She blamed me for my brother hating her. She used to blame me when me and him would get in fights. He'd always pick on me, always beat on me when I was little.
He's bigger than you?
Yeah, it was all my fault. I couldn't do anything right. And the more I read, the smarter I got, the more she hated me. Because I'd outsmart her all the time, and she just hated me. And she'd always get an attitude with me. She was never there for me. She always ran out on Friday and Saturday nights and be out with her friends and with guys.
You did it by yourself?
I was there by myself, just stuck reading.
Yeah, man, this happens there.
Every day. She wouldn't let me do anything, but she could go out and she could party. My 9th grade year up here, she always just was against me. Just always against me.
So what you're in now is 9th grade?
No, sir. I should be in 11th, but I'm in 10th because I had so much going on my first 9th grade year with my mom. I just could not keep my books down. I just could not do anything. Last night, no, actually it wasn't last night. It was probably about Sunday. I got in from work, and the world just got to me. I just said, I really just don't care anymore. I just stopped caring Friday for some reason. I just couldn't figure out how to stop caring. Last night, I just decided I'm through it. I didn't want to kill my mother. I didn't want to. I do love my mother. It's just I wanted revenge on Christina, and my mom wouldn't just. No, sure, Luke, take the gun, take the car. You gotta understand. I did not want to. It's just the only way. That's the only.
What happened?
I want to say I was planning for this, but yet not. I didn't really want to. It's just.
What would you have been planning for?
I wanted to do this. I wanted revenge on Christina.
Christina? Who's Christina?
Christina Menifee. She's my ex-girlfriend. We broke up about a year ago. She's the first person I shot. I got her right in the heart.
You got up this morning. It was kind of going in your mind?
Yeah, I had kind of planned saying, you know, I'd always joke around since we broke up. I'm going to get her back, you know. I really meant to do it in my mind, but yeah, I didn't want to because it wouldn't be right.
Yeah. I mean, you know the difference between right and wrong.
Yes, sir. Well, I guess the world's going to remember me now. I'm probably going to get pretty famous.
A day after Luke had gotten arrested, on October 2nd, someone apparently posted this on the school door. This says Luke is God from your real friends at Pearl High School in Greek letters. Then a few days later, on I believe October 9th, another note was posted on the school, and this one said, Christina. They took Alan, Wes, Justin, Donnie, Lucas, Grant, and Luke. This is what happens. We told you not to leave AI, or there'd be some shh. They removed 1/4 of our army, but they'll pay soon enough. The end is near, apocalypse now. Sincerely, the Alliance of the Immortals. Think what you want, Lydia was no accident. Now, who exactly posted these notes? I don't believe that was ever figured out, though it's just sick behavior. Also, a huge question arises about who is the Alliance of the Immortals? It's just all very confusing. But on June 5th of 1998, Luke had his first trial for the murder of his mother, and this day he was sentenced to life in prison. A week later, on June 12th, Luke had his second trial for what he did at Pearl High School, and this day he was found guilty on 2 counts of murder and 7 counts of attempted murder. He was given 2 life sentences and 7 20-year sentences for his murderous attempts. Luke is for some reason eligible for parole in 2046, though he'll be 65 years old if he even makes it there. Luke attempted to plead insanity for both cases, but that did not work. Luke most likely was not insane. He said himself he was of a sound mind, but an evil one at that. Not only this, but he had Grant right next to him as the devil on his shoulder. We'll get into Grant in a second, but just know that it was not only Luke arrested and charged, but so were all 6 other members of the Croft. The students arrested were Delbert Shaw, Wesley Brownell, Donald Brooks, Lucas Thompson, Justin Sledge, and Grant Boyette, and they were all charged with conspiracy to commit murder, aka the police believed they were involved in the school shooting plot, and accessory to murder. Now, by July 23rd of 1998, all charges were dismissed for Delbert, Wesley, and Donald. Conspiracy charges were dropped for both Grant and Justin, but they were still on trial for accessory to murder. Lucas Thompson's case was transferred to youth court, and what happened to him is unknown because those records are sealed. Now, by December 21st of 1998, a judge dropped all of the charges against Justin Sledge. He was now a free man. But Grant Boyette, however, well, his trial was just starting. Grant was facing 3 counts of accessory to murder because he was the supposed mastermind of everything. On February 3rd of 2000, Grant was re-indicted on the charges that he faced with the killings. Now, the defense attorney named Rick Mitchell, who wanted to close the case completely, had felt like the state had spent too much money on the case and that it needed to be faster and a conclusion needed to happen. Apparently, Rick asked the victims' families how they felt about a plea deal with Grant, and supposedly no one objected because they wanted the trials to finish so they could get on with their lives. So 5 days later, on February 8th of 2000, Grant Boyette pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of conspiring to impede a public official. In exchange for this, his accessory to murder charges would be dropped. This new charge stated that Grant told Luke things that would have disrupted the school and prevented school officials from doing their job. Apparently, this DA also went for a plea deal because he didn't think Luke was a credible witness. 3 more days later, on February 11th of 2000, Grant was sentenced to 5 years, and all of it could be on probation if he completed an inmate discipline program. AKA Grant Boyette got off incredibly lightly for the evil crimes that he committed. What a terrible DA. So many of them are the reason for a lot of evil people not going to jail and being allowed to roam the streets. This is a prime example. They found some bogus, random, lesser degree charge that makes no sense because the DA is lazy and doesn't want to spend money or the time needed. Absolutely crazy. But at least Luke Woodham is in jail for hopefully the rest of his life. What he did was absolutely awful, and the people he murdered were not forgotten. Mary Ann Timms Woodham was 50 years old and a Christian woman who sang at church and taught classes there. Mary Ann was considered to be an all-around great mom, and while Luke said that she was a terrible mother and yada yada, in reality, she did all she could and really looked after her children. She did not deserve what Luke did to her. Lydia K. Dew was a kind girl, only 17 years old, and considered to be very friendly. She was a competitive weightlifter and could bench about 110 pounds. She loved animals and helping people at any cost. Lydia is remembered as, quote, a ray of happiness, sunshine, and joy. Christina, or Christy Michelle Menifee, was only 16 years old when she was murdered. Christy loved animals so much and the world in general. She wanted to become a veterinarian one day, and she had a bunch of animals, a dog named Fluffy, a hamster named Joey, and a dwarf rabbit named Snow. Christy also really cared for plants and even had her own rose garden in her family's backyard. The reason that Christy and her family moved to Pearl from her home in Florida was because her father Bob had just recently gotten out of the Navy and began working as an electrician. A new job for him popped up in Pearl, Mississippi, and he heard from someone that it was one of the safest communities he could go to, so he did. Bob had promised to give Christy his car for her 17th birthday, but sadly, she would never make it there. Christy and Luke also barely even dated once again. I mean, it was for like 3 weeks or so, and Luke only kissed her on the cheek. Regardless, this little fling was unfortunately a huge deal to him. He just couldn't let go. Rest in peace to Christy, Lydia, and Mary Ann. I hope they're all resting peacefully. But anyways, thank you for watching this episode of High Time Crime. If true crime is your thing, then please like and subscribe because it's all we do. I also have an all-exclusive Patreon if you're interested in that. There's a bunch of tiers to choose from, and the third one allows for you to see a Patreon-only video, and that tier and the second one allow you to have your name at the end of each High Time Crime video. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care, friend.